Hey, what's good, self-direct investors? I hope you're all doing great, and I want to welcome you back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Jordan. I'm the mind behind Make More Capital, and today we're coming at you with a midweek update in the world of cannabis. Now, before we jump in, if you enjoyed this video or you learned something, please just leave a like on it as it really helps out my channel. And of course, if you want to learn how to take advantage of this generational investment opportunity, subscribe below so that you don't miss any future videos, but then there's plenty of content for you to go back, rewatch, and educate yourself with. I've tried to put all the news and facts in one place so that you can watch episodes over time to learn about the evolution of the industry, identify top companies that you keep seeing pop up, and take advantage whenever you're ready. And as we continue to move through uncharted territory, I wanted to share this snippet from Garv Invest to start this episode, as it highlights some digging that people are probably trying to do to figure out what is the state of the Safe Banking Act in the America Competes Act. And he shares this snippet from Congress.gov, and it says short titles as passed the Senate, and as we can see here, he has circled the Safe Banking Act of 2022. And so at first glance, this would lead someone to believe that the Safe Banking Act might have passed through the Senate version of the America Competes Act. But just to put some context, to add some context to this, wanted to share this question from SammyJ as he poses the question, any clarification here on the Competes Act listing safe banking as passed both the House and the Senate? And then we have Simpleton reply saying Gavin Bade should know best. And so apparently Gavin is a reporter from Politico Pro, probably works with Nats Fertig, but he adds some input and he says, so technically both chambers have passed bills, but they aren't final yet because they aren't identical. And that's the next step into the conference process. As Senate moves, yesterday sends it back to the House, which will reject it and request a conference. That's when they decide what's in the final bill to send to Biden. And so in the next few weeks, we will find out whether SAFE makes it in America Competes Act or not. And while we do want it to be in there, prepare for the worst, as many did get their hopes up in December, including myself, when SAFE made it all the way to the conference process in the NDAA, only for political posturing to step in at the last moment and pull it out when it should have gotten passed, as it is good policy. But just to add a little bit more, but before they can send it to Biden, each chamber will have to vote again on the final compromise legislation, so it can't change so much that it loses support in either chamber. And then so Harry Henderson asks a great question here. In layman's terms, will the safe banking bill now be included in one form or another for sure? Since it passed on the surface, does the revised one also guarantee a passing vote from both chambers? And Gavin responds, it does not mean it will necessarily be included in the final bill. In fact, far from it, the Senate has blocked it in the past, right, Nats Fert? And that in reference to Schumer pulling the simplest version of SAFE from the NDAA in December, which would have really only helped the small business and minority entrepreneurs that voted for Schumer. And that seems the most likely outcome here, as he's going to again show that he really works for big pharmaceutical companies as opposed to the people that voted him in. And that's why we need to make a serious change come November. The text at this point is immaterial to my knowledge, except to confuse us. How convenient. And so Harry responds, it has certainly been blocked 6 times in the past by Senate. The way I read your comment, as it is passed both but not as written, but if it's passed, lol, oh man, probably best not to overthink and allow the dominoes to fall where they do. And that's sort of my approach as well. Let the dominoes fall where they must and just prepare for the worst. Hope to be pleasantly surprised. And so on to this one, wanted to share an update. So thank you, Abner Curtin, for sharing this. As Senate President Nick Scuteri plans hearings on delays with legal cannabis sales from the NJ Senate Democrats. Thank you, Senator. The CRC will face accountability, and I think this should get things moving. As he announced yesterday that he will form a special legislative committee to review the delays with legal cannabis sales in New Jersey. And so if you want to read the whole article, you can grab it below. But I think it's great to see that after 17 months of unnecessary delays, someone in New Jersey with a position of power finally also recognizes the incompetence from the CRC and decides to hold them accountable. So I do hope to get a good update in the future from that. Well, I wanted to share this from Tom Engel, which is just another example of some state representatives finally showing their teeth and showing that they have a bit of bite, as today Washington state treasurers and cannabis regulators tore into Congress for its failure to pass cannabis banking legislation amid a spate of deadly robberies at dispensaries. Because that is true. If you don't pass SAFE, $25 billion in cash just stays on the streets, and that makes these dispensaries targets for armed robberies. And Schumer knows that. Why he doesn't want to pass that and work for the American people is a damn shame. But good to hear from the Washington treasurer. A decade of congressional dithering is enough, and it's time to pass safe banking. Just wanted to share this awareness from USA Today, highlighting as more cannabis dispensaries are targeted by robbers, and that is a fact. Safe banking is the solution, but for some reason it lingers in Congress. So just sharing as a bill that could allow electronic transactions at weed dispensaries nationwide is again making, a bit of a typo there, making its way through Congress, but the Safe Banking Act might not be the cure-all that supporters envision. Well, it's the first practical step into incremental reform, so that is why it is in the best interest to get it passed for the American people. And so just wanted to share this interview from CNBC that they did with Ben Kovler from Green Thumb Industries. And my bad, while I had every intention of playing this video for you today, unfortunately my computer does not want to cooperate and it is sitting in buffer mode. So you can grab the link below, but I do recommend you watch it as Ben is a great communicator and he highlights that what does happen at the federal level doesn't really affect MSOs in the legal states, and that the MSOs in legal states are just focusing on what they can control within the states and expanding their operations. But he does also touch on the ridiculousness of US media networks showing Canadian LPs when a US MSO executive is on there and talking. And so obviously, while we get frustrated by that, just want to share this news that came out of left field, but obviously contradicts a lot of what we've heard about US MSOs and SAFE not being able to uplist. So again, I don't know, but I'm just sharing the news as MJ Biz Daily reports that company tapped by the DEA to grow cannabis for research gets to file on the NASDAQ? Like what? And US MSOs still can't? So again, this is very annoying, but I'm just going to share the story with you. As a Florida company with conditional approval from the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration to cultivate cannabis for research purposes could become the first U.S. plant-based touching business to trade on the NASDAQ market. Well, hopefully this would set a precedent that would allow the U.S. MSOs to uplist as well, as Bright Green Corp, headquartered in Fort Lauderdale, filed plans Tuesday with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to register its shares on the NASDAQ under the ticker symbol BGXX. And the fact that they're a plant-touching company and they can do this while other U.S. MSOs can't, I don't get it. But just to add, in its SEC filing, Bright Green noted it has received conditional approval based on already agreed terms from the USDA, the DEA. So that's likely what has given them the ability to actually do this, to produce federally legal cannabis. But despite this, cannabis's illegal status under federal law has prevented the US-based plant-touching companies from listing on major US exchanges such as the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange, which is very unfortunate, but I do hope that because of this, we might get some solution to that problem. But I just wanted to share a bit more info, as apparently according to Tuesday's securities filing, final DEA registration is anticipated in May of this year, contingent upon the completion of Bright Green's facilities and a successful inspection by the Federal Drug Agency. While the DEA declined to comment on Bright Green's status, I do wonder who owns the shares in Bright Green's and who has been given the green light to be able to uplist while MSOs can't. That sparks my curiosity. But then also, the federal government in recent years has also allowed U.S. researchers to import cannabis products from abroad. I didn't know that. That's the first we're hearing of that, which included licensing cannabis produced for Tilray in British Columbia. I didn't know that. That's also news. And so it seems a lot goes on behind the scenes that we're not aware of. But for whatever reason, if we do see the first plant-touching company uplist, I would love to see at some point in time, sooner than later, the ability for US MSOs to uplist as well. So on to news from Marijuana Moment, as bipartisan lawmakers file amendments to the federal cannabis legalization bill that is up for a House vote. Well, they plan to take this up on Monday, as I mentioned in my Sunday video. Isn't it ironic that those that don't consume cannabis can't seem to get anything done on time, as that's now been pushed back to Wednesday? So far, several amendments have been introduced, but it's possible that more will be filed in the days to come. And while this sounds like progress, it's more just political theater and fluff to make this a bipartisan effort, as the MORE Act, sponsored by House Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler, already passed the House in 2020, but it did not advance in the Senate. And sadly, we know that, and we want a bill like this to get passed through the Senate because we want to deschedule cannabis and we want to release people from prison. But if a bill doesn't have the votes, it's just not going to pass. We do have to be realistic in politics. And it's cleared the sponsors panel again this session in September, and I guess that's why they're hopeful that this will help attract positive attention towards cannabis in the media. And so now, with the floor vote imminent, lawmakers are seeking changes. Here's a description of what the proposed revisions would do. And a lot of this is, again, just fluff and useless additions to the bill. So I'm not going to read through them, but you can pause to read if you want to learn more about some of what they're doing to it. So what would the MORE Act do as drafted? Well, if you're new to my channel and don't know much about the MORE Act, I would recommend just pausing to read this snippet here, as this covers the juice of what the bill would do. Essentially descheduling cannabis so it's no longer an illegal substance, and then for that reason it releases people from jail because it's no longer illegal. And I think this is the best incremental step to right the past wrongs, obviously, and to give equal access to opportunity to as many people as possible. But then when we say, well, why won't the MORE Act pass the Senate? Because the Dems want to add all these free handouts and social equity incentives at the federal level, which I just don't think is the best way to go about it. And so that is the reason why people say that it will not pass in the Senate. But just to give context, there's another bill that was introduced by Republican Nancy Mace that's very similar to the MORE Act, known as the States Reform Act. And this bill is very similar, deschedules cannabis so there's no more 280E tax because cannabis is no longer illegal. It expunges records, but the main difference between the States Reform Act and why States Reform Act actually has a chance versus the MORE Act is because the MORE Act wants to implement a federal excise tax starting at 5% for the first 2 years, then raise that to 8% by the 5th year, whereas the States Reform Act just sets a 3% tax all the way through. And so obviously, if you are more business-minded, you realize the lower the tax you have to pay in the beginning helps you compete and eliminate the illicit market as best as possible, but then allows for the actual success success of your industry in the long run, because you're not giving all of your profits away in the beginning to taxes. And so just wanted to add that, as I think that's a main reason why most people see the States Reform Act as being a better solution than the MORE Act. Well, secondly, even yesterday, Nancy Mace announced that she could not support the MORE Act as it is in the House right now because of all the proposed free federal handouts that it would also entail. And she makes a great point, because the last thing we want is more federal overreach into this industry. We want less government, and we want the states to be able to make their own choices. And so obviously with her bill, she would allow states to launch their own programs, whether they want to go social equity focused or not. It would be up to the states, which I think is the best play in the long run, as the US is the laboratory of democracy, and that's how it was designed, and that's how it should be run. And so just to round this up, meanwhile, advocates and stakeholders are eagerly awaiting the formal introduction of a separate Senate legalization bill that's being finalized by Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and colleagues. As Schumer recently said, his plan is to file that bill, the CAOA, which again also will not pass the Senate whatsoever, but he does plan to file this in April to help gain buzz around this. And so I wanted to share this from Synergy Canalife. So thank you, Synergy Canalife, for sharing this update, as the House and Senate will be out of session from April 8th to April 25th. So the only near-term chance of movement on SAFE is through the Competes Act, if it comes out of the conference still in the bill and voted on before Easter break, while the MORE Act is nothing more than a distraction now. And so while I have you here, and while we're back on the Competes Act, in the description there is a link to contact Nancy Pelosi directly and express your support. So please, if you can, if you are American, try to call her office and write in and express your support for SAFE, as that is the best chance of getting SAFE passed in the America Competes Act and to start this process of incremental reform. Thank you, The Hill, for spreading the good news, as this week the House is set to vote on a cannabis legalization bill. And as we move through the week, the wording does change, as the Unusual Whales shares an updated Hill.com article from yesterday with a new title that the House is poised to pass a bill legalizing cannabis. And so while this is great news and good awareness for cannabis, we've known this all along, but the hard part is passing the Senate, where the MORE Act simply does not have the votes. So that is why we want incremental progress, as opposed to trying for everything and not getting anything. And so in more news from SammyJ, this is just a snippet from Viridian and their take on the M&A note this past week. So again, this is not advice, just the views of Viridian Capital Advisors, but they share we expect the trend will continue and even accelerate in the near term, with other large operators looking to acquire smaller established players. And we note that the perceived upside potential is exacerbated by the potential, or by the continued deflated valuations, but that also imposes the risk that you might not get the premium that you like in a potential deal as well. But so this is from Viridian. You can pause to read if you like. On to some other news, this one from MJ Biz Daily, as Cresco's cannabis asset sales could hit $500 million after Columbia Care deal, analysts say. Now again, though, this is just speculation, but I do want to share it, as this is an update from last week. And so where Cresco Labs and Columbia Care cannabis operations overlap. These are all the states where they overlap, but just to share the snippet here, is Cresco Labs is expected to sell off roughly 250 to 500 million worth of cannabis cultivation and retail licenses, largely to meet state license limits, as part of its planned $2 billion acquisition of Columbia Care. So company executives told analysts that Chicago-based multi-state operator Cresco will likely divest assets in Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, New York, and Ohio because of the overlapping operations with New York headquartered Columbia Care in limited license markets. And so this doesn't tell us a whole lot, and it's still early, so we don't know. What this does tell us, though, is that they're going to get a good amount of capital back to help either pay for the acquisition or to pay off debt, and it just gives them flexibility. So that's another reason why I do think this was a good deal, and I do like to see this as we get more information on this deal. On to this one from U.S. News. What's ahead for recreational cannabis in New Mexico? As cannabis producers and aficionados are bracing for the April 1 start of retail cannabis sales across New Mexico to adults 21 and older. And so the main snippet I wanted to get out of this one is just some info from on the ground. As opportunity knocks, so far the state has licensed more than 500 business premises, outdoor farms, greenhouses, retail outlets, and manufacturing facilities for extracts and edibles. In my opinion, this is how you give equal access to opportunity. And the new Cannabis Control Office also licenses cannabis consumption lounges and a private network of testing laboratories to ensure products are free of contaminants and to verify drug potency as listed on labels. Imagine states wanted to see this industry flourish like Arizona or like New Mexico, and already there are 225 licensed retail outlets, though not all will open on day one. So just wanted to share that, as that does give us more info of what's actually happening on the ground in New Mexico. It seems like everyone in that state is very ready for this launch. So I wanted to share that. And on top of that, New Mexico signs cannabis agreements with tribes days ahead of legal sales launch, as they should. And what this will do, the legal recreational cannabis sales begin in New Mexico this week, and 2 tribal communities are ready to jump in this industry. And thank you, New Mexico, for not giving them any headaches or troubles for doing that, as the pueblos of Picuris and Poyoak, I apologize if I pronounce those wrong, signed an intergovernmental agreement with New Mexico that allows them to regulate their own cannabis enterprises operating within their communities and apply for state licenses for any business they would conduct outside of tribal lands, as they should. So good job, New Mexico, and I wish you the best of luck with your launch, which I think would come tomorrow or Friday. Well, I wanted to share this one from Marijuana Moment, as most New York voters oppose prioritizing cannabis licenses for people with prior convictions, poll finds. I think this is very interesting as well, because I'm all for righting the past wrongs and giving as much equal access to opportunity as possible. But does this show that the Dems might have overplayed their hand with so much virtue signaling through social equity? So the survey from Siena College shows that only 33% of New Yorkers favor ensuring that many of the first licenses for cannabis retail stores go to those previously convicted of cannabis retail crimes or their family members, compared to 54% who are opposed and 13% who said they aren't sure. So wow, does this say a lot for who might actually get voted in New York as well? Because it's an interesting data point, as there's generally widespread consensus among legalization advocates that those most impacted by cannabis criminalization should be specifically empowered to participate in the industry. But for New Yorkers, and this is probably a large subset of the American population, according to this poll, that shouldn't necessarily mean that those who were directly impacted by prohibition should be the first in line to open up shops. The crosstabs of the poll found that a plurality of Democrats, 45%, believe those with cannabis convictions should be prioritizing in licenses versus 43% who oppose that proposal, while 50% who identify as liberal are supportive, while a majority of Republicans, 72%, and self-identified conservatives, 74%, say they are against giving those with past convictions the benefit of launching cannabis businesses first. Only 19% of Republicans and 16% of conservatives feel those most impacted by criminalization should be prioritized. And fair enough. Seems like it's not that they're against giving them an opportunity, but maybe just not the first dibs. Maybe once the industry's started and they've launched the adult use program, then help them get in. Obviously many different approaches, but that seems to be the consensus. As meanwhile, political independents oppose the idea, 29% to 55%. And lastly, just to add, 48% of black people, a group that has been disproportionately impacted by prohibition, said that directly affected communities should get licensing priority, with 52% of Latinos are also on board, compared to just 29% of white people. But interesting to note that that's less than 50% of black people. So not even the majority say that those directly affected should be given licensing priority. So very interesting out of New York. Onto some news from Tennessee, as a Tennessee bill creating the framework for medical cannabis program passes a House subcommittee, while the House of Representatives Health Committee will discuss the bill on Wednesday, which is today. And so just a bit more info on this bill, which is titled HB 2641, was introduced by Representative Brian Terry and would establish the framework for a medical cannabis program to start on July 1st of 2023, overseen by the Medical Cannabis Commission. So still very early for Tennessee, but good to see some progress slowly but surely making its way through there. Well, I wanted to share this one from Marijuana Moment, as senators urge Biden Attorney General to respect Indian tribes' cannabis policies, as they should. And so for more info on this, the letter led by Senator Martin Heinrich requests that the Justice Department respect the inherent sovereignty of tribal governments and cease the enforcement of the Controlled Substances Act on tribal lands as it pertains to the growth, possession, and use of cannabis for medicinal, agricultural, and recreational purposes, where those tribes have legalized this activity for its own members and those acting in compliance with tribal laws. And after this much time, it is the least that the DOJ could do, right? As tribal governments that have chosen to legalize cannabis have determined what is best for their members and residents of their lands, much like states, and how best to prioritize their law enforcement resources, it said. Reminding the DOJ that they should respect these sovereign decisions and reallocate their investigative and prosecutorial resources accordingly. As the letter notes that there was previous Obama-era DOJ guidance on prosecutorial discretion for tribal governments that opted to legalize cannabis, but that was rescinded by then Attorney General Jeff Sessions in 2018, along with a separate memo urging prosecutors not to go after the states that establish regulated cannabis markets. And while this is still rescinded, it'd be great if Merrick Garland would put it back into action and create a Cole Memo 2.0 that would then protect medical cannabis companies, adult use cannabis companies, and tribal governments from the DOJ abusing their powers. As this discretion rightfully recognized the inherent sovereignty of tribal governments to regulate their own affairs, the senators wrote of the now rescinded guidance. And so hopefully the DOJ can respect that and possibly reinstate the Cole Memo, make it the 2.0 version. But on to a study, as medical cannabis may help you avoid opioids for back pain, arthritis. Another study telling us what we already know from many other studies, but want to highlight as many patients prescribed opioids for their chronic pain wound up taking fewer painkillers or stopped them altogether after doctors certified them for medical cannabis, says lead researcher Dr. Asif Ilyas, an orthopedic surgeon at Rothman Orthopedic Institute in Philadelphia. We found broadly a significant reduction in opioid use when they started using medical cannabis, Ilya said. We saw a decrease in approximately 40% of opioid use after starting medical cannabis, with 37% to 38% of patients completely discontinuing opioids altogether. And there you have it again, more evidence that cannabis is the gateway drug, and while we got to deschedule this plant so that we can research it further and provide a safer, non-addictive alternative. And so onto some other news globally, as apparently the Bahamas plans to consider legalizing cannabis as cannabis legislation passes 18-6, setting up a constitutional face-off. And so this is interesting, as it will be legal to grow and sell cannabis if controversial legislation passed the House of Assembly yesterday gets royal assent from the governor. And the Cannabis Licensing Act 2022 would create a regulated framework for growth and sale of the drug, and a series of licenses would be available through a licensing authority, which will allow people to not only possess more of the drug, but also to grow, harvest, sell, and export it. Sounds like great news for the citizens of Bermuda, but what makes this bill controversial, from my understanding, is that Rina Lalgi, the governor, has made it clear legislation of cannabis for recreational use was not allowed under the UK's international obligations. So it sounds like Bermuda is still a colony of the UK in some way or somehow, which is not a good look in 2022. But Mr. Burt has warned that if the act did not get royal assent, it would destroy Bermuda's relationship with Britain. Mr. Roban admitted that the legal changes could cause friction with the UK, but he added that is the type of trouble this government is not afraid of. And he makes total sense when he says the totality of the proposed legislation provides for better, effective regulatory control to displace the illicit market and full economic access at a time when families are suffering and looking for new economic opportunities. Boom. Couldn't have said it better. And so just to add, the bill was approved by 18 votes to 6, and all 6 OBA MPs voted against it. And the bill will go to the upper house next week and will be passed because senators can only veto legislation once. And then, so from my understanding, they do have to get royal assent, which is the next step. And I will update you, and hopefully Bermuda does get that victory for themselves and their citizens. While lastly, just wanted to share this one out of Nepal, as the health ministry set to give a nod to research on cannabis for medical purposes. So love to hear that, as the Ministry of Health and Population is preparing to approve research on cannabis for medicinal purposes. The decision was taken at a meeting chaired by Minister for Health and Population, Birod Kadiwada. And it may be noted that Minister Kadiwada has been advocating legalization of the use of cannabis for a long time, so great to see him taking the proper steps to turn that into reality. And that is it for today's episode, folks. So I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and I really hope you got some value out of it. What did you think of the stories mentioned? Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or suggestions, and I'd be happy to address them. But besides that, if you enjoyed this video and you learned something, please just leave a like on it, subscribe below if you don't want to miss any future videos, and I will catch you on Friday for a special episode of Trulieve's earnings and any updated news that we get by Friday, and then I'll see you on Sunday for This Week in Cannabis News. Have a great week, everybody.